Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I see some smiling faces, so that's good, you know. One of the key remedies for depression is to smile. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Rasul Kareem. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. It's a pleasure to be here again with you all to talk about an important topic. And there are many reasons why you might have found yourself here. Could be for some of the other ones, they've been dragged here for Salat al-Dhuhr. For others, it could be because it's something which they have perhaps experienced and they're looking to try and find are there some solutions or extra things that they can do if they are faced with symptoms of depression. Or perhaps for others, it could be that they are dealing with family members or associates, close friends, who may be going through or undergoing bouts of depression, and how do you begin to deal with it? And for those of you or for someone who does not understand depression, it can well result in something which is, as much as you might want to do something which is beneficial, you could end up with something which can make the situation even worse. So I think, overall it's an important topic, and when the brothers asked me to talk about this in the month of Ramadan, it's also a reminder that Ramadan or no Ramadan, it is something which can affect us, and it can also, in a sense, ruin Ramadan for somebody who is undergoing or have such symptoms. So when we talk about this whole area of depression, it is something which is quite widespread, and it's something which goes over all cultural and religious groups. So it's not something which is only for a particular group or people who may have a faith or who don't have a faith. It doesn't matter if you are the Imam, a Maulana, Hafiz, just a normal person on the street. All of you can suffer from this, and it can affect you equally. And that's something which is really important, because sometimes the message goes out, and I've seen it sometimes on YouTube, where the solution is that, you need to have stronger Iman. And therefore, if your Iman is strong, that equates to then, why are you depressed? You are a Muslim, so what's the problem? And without understanding that this is something which is beyond just, somebody's spiritual state. So that's the first point I just want to make it clear, that, what we're talking about here is something which goes above and beyond what we would normally, people normally experience. The other thing is that sometimes things happen to us in our lives, and then we can, sometimes we say, I feel a little bit depressed. But feeling a little bit depressed for a moment is not the same thing of suffering from depression. And depression, when we think about it, is also part of a spectrum. So there are a spectrum of different mental health disorders which can all form part of it. And it all starts with stress. It can start even without stress. It can be anxiety. So you have anxiety, you have stress, you have somebody's perhaps just change in their mood, becoming a bit more fragile in terms of, becoming a little bit more angry, and then developing further and further even more symptoms of depression. And then this could even lead on to other type of disorders, maybe obsessive compulsive disorders and different type of psychiatric disorders as well. So it's a whole spectrum of different things, and if not carefully dealt with at some stage, at an early stage, it could really result in something which becomes entrenched. It has effect not just on the person, but it can also have effect on those around that person. So you might feel that, I'm down, and why don't everybody else understand me in the house, because I'm going through this trauma or that trauma. But what may well happen is because of your change in your mood and your change in your behavior, this is also having an impact on your family, on your work colleagues, and everyone else. And because of that, everybody else, and then this may well, you also, it's almost like, we talk about viruses spreading, but if it is that you have, if your mood changes, your mood can also change the mood of everybody else. It's the same as if, there was a comedian who was standing here. I'm not a comedian, but if there was one who was joking, it may well make us feel as though and heighten our state of, our emotional state. And the same thing can happen perhaps in an opposite way. If there is somebody who is undergoing or has symptoms of depression, then it can have the opposite effect. It just dampens the whole thing for everyone else. Now, when it comes to and I did mention that depression is something which goes on across the board in all cultures, all religions. If you think about globally, how many people do suffer from it and who are perhaps diagnosed with it, we're looking at something like over 280 million people. So it's a huge number of people. If you think about it just here in the UK and in other high-income countries, what we find is that within somebody's lifespan, 1 in 6 of us will go through periods and bouts of depression. Within a 12-month period, we find that 1 in 20 of us will be undergoing a bout of depression. When it comes to females are far more prone to develop depression than males. The ratio is about 2 to 1. So I think from these figures alone, it tells you that it is a significant problem. And it's a problem in which everybody needs to know about. People who provide services to the public, like our mosques, they need to be able to understand and they ask themselves the question, if the incidence of this condition is so high, well, as an institution, what am I doing? What type of services can I provide to be able to help people who might be undergoing, but also to be, in a sense, preventive? And when it comes to the whole area of prevention, of course the area of prevention starts with first understanding, as with any doctor will tell you, you need to understand what the symptoms are. What do people present with? And if you think about it, you can group people's presentation of the symptoms that they may have in 2 different categories. One is that of the physical symptoms that they have, the things that they exhibit, in terms of the change in the physical state, but also the other one we can describe them as being physiological. So when I talk about physiological, I'm talking about it could be a change in their mood, so that their mood becomes dampened. You find that they are very prone, you find that it could be that you're just having a normal discussion, and suddenly a point is made and you think that's a normal comment, and then the response is totally different than what you would normally expect. So that is something, so change in the mood, the change in your attitude, perhaps somebody who is prone and they find that they get angry very quickly. Anything that you tell them seems to be almost setting them off. So their emotional state becomes very, very vulnerable. Or it could be the opposite. It could be that somebody who is normally very sociable, very talkative, and then what happens is that you find that they're not saying anything. They don't seem to be communicating. The sense of perception that they have of everything around them, they're not concerned. Ordinarily, they might be concerned about the only month of Ramadan is coming, and they might say, yeah. It's almost as if there's no that sense of enthusiasm is not there. And these are those subtle changes in a person's emotional state is something which is important for us to be able to recognize. And it could be within our homes. And it could be just a person who's undergoing who's anxious and perhaps undergoing something stressful at work. But if not managed appropriately, that could lead from just mere stress into that person becoming very anxious and that person developing symptoms of depression. The other thing, as I mentioned, in terms of the physical thing, what do you notice sometimes? It could be that their sleep pattern changes. So it could be that they're sleeping far more than they would normally do, so that they're getting up quite late and you don't understand what's happening. It could be that they're sleeping far less. And to the extent that when they wake up, you think that they're sleeping and you think that they've had a good night's rest. But when you look at them, then you realize, hold on, they still look very sleepy, they're very listless, they don't seem to have any energy. So it's almost as if they need to go back to sleep again. So that type of change is something. And then when you think about their appetite also becomes affected. It could be that they perhaps they seem to be eating far more. Sometimes when people become very stressful or very anxious, there are some people who would like to eat. They just keep on eating, just to be able to help control some of their symptoms. Or it could be the opposite. It means that they just don't want any food. They feel as though their appetite has gone totally. And should you eat something? What about breakfast? What about lunch? And you find that no, I don't want. I'm not feeling hungry. I don't want anything to eat again. But again, understanding that is all part of something else. And this has so you find that it could be a measure of, it could be weight loss, weight gain. It could also affect in terms of their bowel habits. So both your urinary and your bowels can be affected in terms of people could develop things like physical things like diarrhea or perhaps constipation or even symptoms in terms of wanting to go to the washroom, to pass urine and so forth and so on. So if you think about it, there's a whole host of different symptoms we're talking about. So what do we mean when we use the term depression? What we're talking about is that we're talking about as a constellation of some of these symptoms which you would see. So having one thing on its own is not necessarily that, oh, you're depressed. But it's when it's there and it's there for a significant period of time, then it's what it's something to take note of. And if we who are here understand how it is that we can perhaps, in a sense, as a doctor would do, diagnose or be able to understand what are the signs, what are the things that I'm seeing, and to be able to put them together, then it puts you in a better position to be able to recognize that there is a problem and to be able to think about what is the best way I can help that person, or even I can help myself address that problem. And that comes to the next point. And the next point is this. Very often what I've just said about a change in somebody's physiological and physical state, it might be easy for you to be able to look at someone and say, yeah, he's different. And this is what might well be happening. But if I were to say, well, perhaps you are exhibiting the same thing as well, you say, oh, of course not, I'm absolutely fine. So there is this sort of protective mechanism that a lot of us has, especially among men. And this is perhaps, the figures tell us that it's 2 to 1 female to male when it comes to depression. But in a sense, these figures may also be skewed by in terms of who are the ones who are far more easier to be able to declare that, look, they have a problem. And you find that females are much easier to be able to recognize and to have insight in terms of their state rather than men. So men having depression in terms of the consequences can be far more problematic than that of even of females. Of course, things can change. So having insight is something which is really important, and also having insight into yourself. And having insight in terms of recognizing that I'm having a problem, that how do I begin to deal with this problem that I'm having? And why am I feeling a little bit more anxious than I normally would be? Why it is my hand seems to be shaking, or the words can't seem to be coming out the way that I would like it to come out. So simple things like that, and then you begin to understand yourself. And the whole idea is that in terms of our own emotional well-being, it's really important for us to be able to understand our emotions. And to be able to do so, we have to be very much self-conscious and to be able to think about what we do, how we're doing it, and also to reflect upon what we do, what is the impact it is having on others. And perhaps the people who are closest to us, especially our family members and our close friends, they are the ones to be able to realize that there are things which are not right with us from the very beginning. But the problem is that very often what people do is that, oh, it's my mother again, it's my sister again, it's my brother again. And we become very dismissive of what they are saying because they're very close to us, and we don't want to be, feel as though that we'll be put down in front of them. So we would deny all of these things. Say, no, I don't have a problem. What are you talking about? When they can see subtle changes which might be happening, which you might say, well, look, at work nobody seems to care or have noticed anything. Why are you saying this about me when everybody else seems to be fine? I'm in the mosque and I talk to everybody else, I'm doing everything, but at home you see I'm different. So it could be that you need to be able to take note and being able to recognize that there is feedback which is coming, and that feedback is meant for you to reflect on, and for you to recognize that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, is something which is really important. So that's the next thing I wanted to talk about. Now, in terms of well, we're looking at it from an Islamic perspective in terms of what it is that Islam tells us. I think for the first thing for us to be able to recognize, there are some principles that we should take note of, and these are some important Quranic principles. And the first is that when you look into the Quran, what you will note is that this whole area of not just physical suffering, but emotional suffering is something which is described over and over again in the Quran. The emotional well-being of people. When you look into the Quran, what you will note is that you see stories of, let's say, of the Anbiya, of the prophets. But these prophets were not supermen, in a sense. They were not people who were impermeable to, what might happen in life, to the disturbances, to problems, to challenges they might face from others, to accusations that they might face from others. They themselves, and the Quran makes the point that they were bashar, they were human beings. They were human beings. And as human beings, that they would also face the same thing as any other human beings. Sure enough, they had a role as a prophet and a role as a messenger. And that's a role that they have, in the capacity as between themselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the role and that's the job in a sense that they were given. But as a human being, they were human beings. And they would elicit human responses. And you will see that if you think about Prophet Yaqub, amongst the best of the prophets. But when the situation happened with his son, Yusuf and Benjamin, we can see the response. We can see it. We talk about it having a psychological and physical effect on you, but you can see that he became blind. To the extent, with so much crying and so much grief, and what happened to him. When you look at the story of Ayub in the Quran, you see that somebody who lost his family, he lost his wife, he lost his estate, he lost everything that he had, and now he got a disease which everybody will, when they looked at him, realized, hold on, and they ran away from him. And then all this high reputable status which he had, suddenly everything disappeared. Nobody cared about him anymore. He became somebody with such a high standing society, suddenly became somebody who was just there hiding behind, not being able to communicate with anyone else. And so you find that, and even if you look at the story of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as much as he was the best of the messengers, but you see instances in his own life, in the death of his children. And if you look at his life, you realize that his wife Khadija he buried, and he buried all of his children except Fatima. All of them died. So I mean, you can think about the emotions that when he had to go through. He didn't have any male progeny that to be able to, and the last one died when he was very young, Ibrahim. So you can see all of this turmoil taking place. I mean, we call in the Sirah, we have a year which is called Aam al-Huzn, which is the year of sorrow. And that's the year when his pillar of strength in Abu Talib and his wife Khadija, both of them passed away in the same year. And then the Sahaba would notice that, this person who seemed to be all strong, but they can see a different side to him, a different human side in a sense, where he was crying, he needed to be consoled, and he behaved just as they would behave. And this is something which is really important, because the Quran does recognize human emotions, and this comes through over and over again in the Quran. It's easy to go into the Quran and delve in it and think it's a book of legislation, but when you delve deeper in terms of what are the human emotions, you see all of them being exhibited there. The second thing is that this whole aspect of, and this is linked to the first one, of social, emotional, psychological, spiritual factors which kind of have a bearing in your well-being, this is also addressed in the Quran. The Quran talks about even when people are financially in need, to the poor and the needy and the destitute, what happens to them? Because by virtue of their material loss, but this can also lead them into a different direction. Poverty can lead people into kufr. It can lead people into disbelief because of where they find themselves, and sometimes they become far more vulnerable. And then what the Quran does is that the Quran begins to apply a number of different types of mechanisms in terms of how to be able to deal with these things. And we're going to look at some of those in detail as well. And then a recurring theme in the Quran is this whole idea of ease. That Islam is something which is easy. Islam is something which understands the human being, understands the human frailties, and understands that human beings will make mistakes, and understands that human beings will undergo all sorts of challenges that they will need to pick themselves up. And this is the recurring theme. Before Islam was called Islam, in time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was called Ad-Din al-Yusra. It was called the Deen, or the religion of ease. Al-Yusra was a term which was used over and over in the Quran. When you look into the last juz of the Quran, Inna ma'al usri yusra, emphasizing the point about ease. It's about taking you and giving you ease. In the whole surah, which we call Surah Al-Talaq in the Quran, which is about divorce, one of the recurring themes you would find there in that surah is this idea of thinking about taqwa, one, but also realizing that if it is that you were to embrace taqwa, embrace the consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how He will become your provider, and how He can take you away from your state of difficulty into one of ease and provide provision for you. And that's there because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understood that when He was talking about divorce, He was understanding that, and He, as the creator of all human beings, He understood that the level of emotional and the level of distress that people would undergo. And therefore, as much as it was something which is allowed and was discussed, but then the remedy of some of the aftermath of what would take place was being highlighted in that particular surah of the Quran. So let's look at some specific ayat of the Quran now, which sort of addresses some of these things. What are some of the instruments which the Quran talks about? And the first one which I want to mention is that of this whole area of sabr. And perhaps a better term for the word sabr, rather than just mere patience or something which is sort of passive in its nature, is perhaps the word resilience. And this is in keeping with the theme that we have today, which is spiritual resilience. And it's about understanding that yes, you are going to go through difficulty, but also it's about the way that you look at things, the type of mindset that you have a positive outlook in the way that you view things, so that you look at things. So when we look, if we take an ayah of the Quran, for instance, let's say one from وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. If we take this ayah of the Quran, it's a wonderful ayah of the Quran, because what it does, it talks about the idea of test, that human beings will face tests and they will have challenges. And then it begins to highlight 4 key areas. When you think about it, you find that these 4 key areas, in a sense, covers everything that all human beings undergo. And the first one, the Quran talks about this whole area of khawf, of fear. And fear, a lot of fear has to do with the fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown, fear of what exactly? Fear, it could be of maybe something that you've done and you've concerned about it, or it could be something which you are concerned about, which hasn't taken place yet, but you're thinking, well, look, it could be that, things may not be in my best interest, or might be difficult for me in the future. So fear is something that the Quran addresses, that people will undergo all sorts of fear. And this is why when you think about 2 of the things which the Quran talks about, which is going to be present in paradise, it talks about the idea of grief and sorrow. That, وَلَا تَحْزَنْ, that there is not going to be any grief. وَلَا تَمْشُوا فِي الْجَنَّةِ, that there is glad tidings in the paradise. But the idea of grief, there is no grief, there's nothing to be concerned about. And the Quran addresses the past, and the Quran also addresses the future. And that's the 2 things that believers can be guaranteed about in paradise. One is that there's nothing to fear about what has taken place. That account has been settled. And there is no need to worry about what is to come, because what is to come is what you have, and far better than what you have. So why worry? And so all of those things are almost taken away from us. And that's what makes paradise so very different, let's say, from the hellfire, because it answers those psychological needs. Often when you look into the Quran, you might be looking at what are the physical things that paradise offers. But that's not all that human beings need. And when you look deeper into it, you begin to realize that the psychological needs that human beings have far outweigh the physical needs that they might have. And this is why, we talked about the statistics which I gave you earlier on, about 200 plus million people in developing, and the incidence of depression in countries which are high-income countries. When you were to compare some of those figures now with countries where people, they don't have income, they are not as rich as perhaps we are, they don't have the amenities that we have at our disposal, then you begin to realize that people look at things in a very different way. And what we might become easily depressed and concerned about, others will say, well, this is my life. There is a certain stage of acceptance of what you have. And they become people who are far more accepting and in a sense, far more reliant upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I was talking to one of my colleagues who's recently been to Gaza. And when we look at the news reports, we often think, well, oh my gosh, look what's happening there. And, all of these people, what is it? Look at what is happening. And then when he began to tell me the stories about their level of resilience that they have, how tough they are mentally. Not that, I'm not trying to downgrade their physical condition, but it's almost as if, the Quran says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah is not going to place upon you a burden greater than that which you can bear. One is equal to the other in a sense. You begin to realize that in a sense, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places people in particular situations, but also gives them and equips them with that which they need to be able to deal with the challenge which is before them. And we know that even from a physiological point of view. You think about somebody, you go outside there is a road traffic accident, somebody gets knocked down, you see broken parts, bits and pieces of their limbs lying on the floor. You think, my God, look at what has happened to him. He must be in such pain and because of the trauma that he suffered. Not realizing that even the body, as it is, has mechanisms in place, reflex mechanisms in place to be able to limit the amount of trauma that you're experiencing. Not that you should get your limbs blown off, but even up to that level in terms of the way that we are constructed as human beings. So it's very interesting how the Quran addresses and how people begin to deal with some of these difficulties. But the point being is that not because you don't seem to have doesn't necessarily mean that you are more depressed. That's not the correlation. The less people have sometimes is they learn to be able to adapt and they develop coping mechanisms to be able to deal with what they have. It's us sometimes who seem to have too much when we lose, the Eiffel falls on the ground, and then we say, my God, what has happened? We get a graze on our BMW outside, and we say, well, who did that? And there is a tantrum. We almost want to, physically assault somebody for what they've done. But if you it's somewhere else and you get a little scratch or a little bump, you say, well, a coat of paint or whatever it is, and off I go again. So that's something important. The Quran talks about this idea of fear, of hunger, and of loss of wealth, of lives, and of your fruits and your vegetation. And if you think about it, during the COVID period, all of those things were present, in a sense, for all of us at a global level. And this is what the Quran talks about. And then the Quran says, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, and give glad tidings to those people who are able to persevere, who develop that sense of resilience. And then the Quran says something very interestingly, as much as it talks about these challenges. It says, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Now the words Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un are not just words which are limited to when someone dies. It could be that you've misplaced your wallet. Inna lillahi wa ilayhi raji'un. What does it remind you of? Where did the wallet come from? Where all of that money came from? It came from Allah. Ultimately, whatever you have is an amana. It's a trust that you have, and it will eventually return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, if you think about even from grammatically what the words are saying, it's saying that we belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah, we belong to Him. He's released us in a sense for a certain amount of time, but we belong to Him. But that belonging also shows that He is linked to us. And therefore, as much as He's linked to us, He cares about us. He's concerned about us. And He will provide to us. And a mere reminder of saying, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, reminds you that Allah is a Rabb. And He's a Rabb just not for you, but for all of creation. And the idea of being a Rabb is that of being a protector, being a nourisher, being a sustainer, and everything else that goes along with it. So, and this is mentioned in the Quran. So, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And therefore, it helps you to be able to put things into perspective. If there is loss of some kind, if there is a test, if you have been put into some difficulty of some time, know that within that difficulty, there will be an outcome. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is looking for is looking at the way that you will deal with that particular difficulty. The difficulty is there, but that difficulty in different times is put to everyone else. Everybody else will have the same different types of challenge. But a challenge is a bespoke challenge. It's not the same challenge for each person. So the challenge I will have will be different from the challenge you will have. Allah will make it bespoke for us. And a challenge in which He's testing us to see how it is that we can deal. We can deal with it. Because otherwise then it makes no sense. Jannah becomes something which is open door. Yeah, you all go inside. We will be tested. And the idea of test is something which is part of who we are and what we've signed up to in coming into this world. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I want to talk about this whole area of something that we do, especially in the month of Ramadan, and that is dhikr. Dhikr, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَتَطْمَئِنَّ الْقُلُوبُ بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنَّ الْقُلُوبُ. That dhikr is something which can find, the heart can find comfort. And again, you know, we talked about the idea of this idea of dhaik. We saw it in Rasul, the ayat which concerned Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is the constriction of the heart. And what dhikr does is it almost releases this constriction of the heart. You know, if you think about Prophet Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, and we think about when he was given the order by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to go to Fir'aun. Anybody remembers the dua that he said? What did he ask Allah for? Anybody? رَبِّ اشْرَحْ لِي صَدْرِي وَيَسِّرْ لِي أَمْرِي وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِّسَانِي يَفْقَهُوا قَوْلِي. So look at the first part. رَبِّ اشْرَحْ لِي صَدْرِي. He's asking for, the first thing he was asking for is the release of this emotional, you know, I'm stressed out, you know, my chest is tight, I want it to be released. And you think about public speaking. Why it is that the vast majority of people don't like to speak in public? But that's exactly what happens. The chest becomes constricted in a sense, and they just, what they would normally want to do, that they just seem to have difficulty in doing, it doesn't seem to come out. And that's part of it. And this is what he was asking for, and this is something to think about. So dhikr can have a very profound effect in terms of what it can do. But what dhikr reminds you that you put things in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you go back to Allah. And as much as there might be difficulties in this world, if Allah is the one who's going to deal with it and you put things into His hands, then it becomes far more easier for you to be able to deal with and handle it, inshallah. The third point I wanted to make is that of this whole area of what is often described as positive psychology. And positive psychology is something which is relatively new. It is something, we had psychology before, but now there is a whole area of positive psychology. And perhaps one word to describe what positive psychology is all about is the word rahmah. That's what positive psychology is. It's about rahmah, it's about this idea of mercy, but this idea of shukr as well, of gratitude. So as much as there is rahmah, when you see Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you see the rahmah coming in there, Allah saying and explaining who He is and what He does for us. Then as a recipient of those who are of that rahmah, that you benefit from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your response and the response that you elicit is Alhamdulillah. And Alhamdulillah is all praise and gratitude is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the idea of being grateful is something, because what happens to people when they become depressed, very often they think, well, nobody likes me again, he doesn't care for me, you know, nobody's concerned about my welfare. I don't think that I'm worth anything. I don't think that others can do what it is that I would normally do. If I were to go away, then nobody would miss me. These are words which come. But when you think about the word rahmah, and when you think about the idea of this idea of shukr and hamd, then you begin to realize that, you know, even the mere lips that I have, even my ability to contemplate and to think and to be able to articulate what I want, that is coming from Allah. Allah is the one who has given it to me. And therefore and this is why the Prophet Muhammad has told us that, you have to look, to be able to appreciate the gifts that you have. You also need to look at those people who do not have those gifts that you have. We talk about living in this part of the countryside where you might benefit from perhaps good air to be able to breathe. There are many parts of this country where, if you're living in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan and other places, where you find that the air quality is so very poor, the amount of problems that people have. So thinking about these little gifts that you have is something which is important. Once you begin to realize that these things, even the mere heartbeat, somebody suddenly develops chest pain here, and they're grappling with their chest pain, and they become out of breath, and they can barely breathe, and you can see them, their breath, their rate of breathing is increasing, and as much as they're increasing, they're not able to take in the same amount of oxygen, and then you see that their state is, they're decreasing until they're becoming far more confused. Then you begin to realize, hold on, look what distress this person is going through. But here am I, being able to breathe, there is no pain, there is no discomfort, I have everything about me, my organs are intact. But what about somebody who doesn't have what you have? What about somebody who you might be able to control your bladder, you might be able to control your bowels? What about somebody who needs to have a colostomy? What about somebody who needs to be able to be changing that so many different times in the day? What about somebody who's incontinent of their urine? We take it for granted that we can go and we can release ourselves whenever we want to, and then we are fine. But what about if somebody who doesn't have that at their disposal? They are limited. What about somebody who is blind and you can see? What about somebody who can't hear? But how much more you can appreciate than what they have. So by beginning to reflect on all of these little blessings, this is why Rasulullah ﷺ saying that, that even 360 joints within the body, that you should be giving thanks, a word of praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for every single one of them. So this idea of gratitude is something which is critical in terms of, trying to rid yourself and get over this whole area of depression. And then the last one I want to mention, because I know time is going, is that of this whole area of tawakkul and putting your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time not becoming fatalistic. And this is where the believer strikes a balance. The believer is saying, on the one hand, yes, everything is in the hands of Allah, we accept it. But at the same time, he's saying, I must do everything within my power, because Allah has given it to me. He has given me agency, He has given me everything that I need, the free will, to be able to make the decisions that will matter. It is your decisions that will determine your fate in the hereafter. It is not the decisions of someone else, or it's not the decision Allah has preordained that. What He has preordained is because by virtue of your decisions. You don't know, or we do not know what Allah has laid forth in His final decision, but it is for us to do what it is that we can. But having that sense of knowing that putting my trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something which will help you to be able to deal in a sense, outsource in a sense, to a much higher authority who will be able to handle some of the difficulties that I might be facing. And this is something important for us, but then still recognizing that we need to be able to play our own role. And this is why I often say that when you think about this whole area of dua is meant to represent, in a sense, a snapshot of your emotions. That's what dua is, a snapshot of emotions. And what dua does, because the Prophet Rasulullah has told us that there is nothing which can change your qadr except dua. So what does that mean? It means that this is known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you will maybe be making that dua. But how does dua help us to change, make a change in terms of our direction of where we go? And the way this is done is because in making the dua, you become far more heightened and you understand what are the dilemmas and difficulties you're undergoing. And dua affords an opportunity for you to recognize to yourself unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there is a problem. In the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan, we will be reciting the dua, Allahumma innaka afu tuhibbul afwa afu anni, over and over again. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? Why do I say it hundreds and hundreds of times in the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan? You say it because when you say it for the first time, it's a recognition that there is something which is wrong. Something which is wrong. Something which needs to be changed. Something that I'm doing that I recognize now that I'm not happy about. I need to change it. So when you say that dua, you ask Allah, I have recognized that I have erred. I have made a mistake. My habits need to change. My lifestyle needs to change. This is what I'm going to do to change it. So therefore, erase what I have done in the past. Forgive me and be able to give me the strength to be able to bear it so that I can make the change. So that's important for us to be able to recognize, because dua on its own, without any effort on our part, is just a mere wishful thinking. It's just a mere articulation of words when Allah would say, well, you're saying these things, but lifestyle, alignment, nothing is there. You know, it's exactly the same. And you see so many people who make a dua, and at the end of the dua, and the life after, the life before is exactly the same. So what's the difference? What role has dua made in terms of changing them? And it's because of the way that you look at the dua. What do you think a dua is? It's just not a mere ritual that you recite, but it's a far more powerful tool. I mean, the tool has been described as being almost like the weapon of the believer, according to Rasulullah. What does that mean? If it's a weapon, it means it's a tool to be used. And once used in the best possible, you can take a tool. You can take a microscope. But if you take a microscope and then you say, well, look, you know, I'm going to take it and point it towards the stars. Do you think it will work? Of course it wouldn't work. It's a microscope. You can look at things which are smaller. It's not going to show me the stars. I need to get a telescope for that purpose. It's the same thing. So you can have a tool, but you need to know how to use that tool. So in a sense, the take-home points that I have from this, and there's a lot more that I can say on this topic, and I know that we are all fasting, and I recognize that, inshallah. It's important for us to have a sense of self-awareness in this whole matter. Try and read up a little bit more about what are the symptoms and signs, and treatment as well, of people who might be suffering from depression. Understand that as much as I have spoken about some things which are there in the Quran and some tools that we have which have been shared in the Hadith literature, that is not the full treatment of it. The Prophet ﷺ has told us that there is a cure as well, there's a medicine as well. And some that medicine means seeking professional help. If you are not able to cope with some of the means that we've spoken about, it is imperative upon you. It is fard upon you, if I want to use that word fard. It is fard upon you to be able to seek services, to be able to seek help for yourself and for others as well, to be able to find solutions for your problem and to be able to deal with things. And it's important as well to be able to understand in the midst of all of this, think about that of being grateful and thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being proactive. Depression is not just physiological, it's not just things which happen to us or emotional things which happen to us which causes depression. It can also be physical things, which means that your physical well-being is also important. The food that you eat also has a bearing, and this is talking about solutions, also has a bearing on whether or not the type of food that you eat, the type of air that you breathe, whether you exercise or not. All of these things are critical things in terms of making sure that you remain in a state of good health, and that's what we want, inshallah. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله.